So it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Paranjoy Guhotakutar, who's going to talk to us about why Indian farmers are angry with the Narendra Modi government. Uh, it is my pleasure because I have known Paranjoy from uh, seems like a century ago, since the 1960s when we went to school together, and we've been close friends since then, although living in different parts of the world. Um, it's an honor because I'm very proud of Foranger's career and activities. He did his undergraduate studies at St. Stephen's College in Delhi, which I think Notre Dame has some sort of connection with now, and I got a master's degree in economics from the Delhi School of Economics. Since then, he has been primarily working as a journalist, first a print journalist working for publications such as Business World, The Telegraph, and India Today. After that, he switched to TV mainly, um, and he anchored a daily discussion program on CNBC India on mainly on political matters, and also had after that had a biweekly program in the Lok Sabha TV, which is the uh, television station owned by the Indian Parliament's lower house. Um, and he has done a lot of other work. He's also produced and directed over 20 documentary films, some short, otherwise, how could he do 20? Uh, Now, since we are in an academic university, I should add that Paranjoy has also had an academic career. He's taught on media and society at major educational institutions in India, including IIM Ahmedabad and IIM Kolkata, and in Delhi University. He's a former editor of the very well-known magazine, academic, political, and economic magazine, Economic and Political Weekly. He is the author or co-author of a number of books, including Media Ethics, Gas Wars, which is subtitled Crony Capitalism and the Ambanis, and then The Thin Dividing Line, India, Mauritius, and Global Illicit Financial Flows, published by Penguin, and most recently, The Real Face of Facebook in India. So his major areas of interest are, as you can see from the titles that I just told you about, the working of political economy and the media in India and the world, in fact. Uh, in particular, he examines the allocation and pricing of natural resources and the working of crony capitalism and oligarchies in India. In doing so, he has taken on the Ambanis, India's top business house, and the Adanis, which is another top business house in India. And I'm afraid this has been at some peril, which perhaps he might, if he wants, tell us something about later. On a lighter note, um, incidentally, he's also been very critical in his writings on the rise of authoritarian and religious nationalist tendencies in India today. On a lighter note, currently in India, India and England are playing a cricket test match in Ahmedabad, Gujarat, which is Modi's home state. The stadium has now been called Narendra Modi Stadium, and it's two ends meaning in a cricket field you have the two ends, and they are called the Reliance, which is Ambani's company, and Adani ends. So you can see how business and politics uh, meet in India uh, these days. So uh, when Michelle mentioned we should have a talk on what's going on in India with the farmers. Um, I immediately thought of Poranjoy and asked him if he would be willing to do this, and he very graciously agreed. My only sadness is that he couldn't be here with us in person, but this is better than nothing. Thank you, Poranjoy.
Thank you so much, Amitabh, as a good Bengali would pronounce your name. Amitabh and I go back from, to be very precise, 1964. I guess there would be at least some in this audience who weren't born at around that time. But thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak. Thank you so much, Megan. Thank you so much, Susan. And may I request, Megan, that when you want me to stop, uh, and before you start the question answer session, maybe you can just sort of alert me and interrupt me and say, okay, 5 minutes left, and I know when I'll have to stop. So thank you very much once again, everybody. I never realized when I agreed to give this talk how significant tomorrow, Saturday, would be. Saturday is the day the farmers' agitation enters its 100th day. I mean, my math is not exactly my strong point, so I never really calculated the number of days. But I realized this morning that it was 100 days. It's going to be 100 days. And it's interesting, the farmers, those who have been agitating, the protesters, they had a very simple slogan. I mean, they said, "We are happy that the farmers have been made visible once again." Once again, since when? Since the 60s, perhaps. A former Prime Minister of India, Lal Bahadur Shastri, he had coined this very famous slogan, Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan. Hail the soldier, hail the farmer. Loosely translated. Now, how significant this is today is something I'm going to elaborate on as we move on. But as we talk for the last 100 days or almost 100 days, there have been literally hundreds of thousands of farmers who have been camping on the outskirts of the national capital of Delhi, the national capital region, and largely in three areas: Singhu, Tikri, Ghazipur. And these have been converted into townships of sorts. Now, these numbers, the estimates vary widely, and therefore it's difficult to come to a precise estimate. I mean, some estimates are huge, some estimates try and play it down, but I will not be, I will be true in saying that there are hundreds of thousands. At different points of time, this number has gone up and gone down, but I have reason to believe that at particular points of time, there were at least 250,000 farmers who were clustered. And these are not just males, there have been women, there have been children, there have been senior citizens, they've been converted. Now, Delhi has very harsh weather, and water cannons were used on the protesters close to midnight. Delhi had a particular harsh winter this time. The weather has changed. You can see I'm wearing a half shirt today. But this was at the peak of winter, where the minimum temperature would drop to zero or next to that, 0 degrees Celsius or centigrade. And this was out in the open. So it was not just water cannons and tear gas and barricades. It was something truly out of the ordinary. And I'm going to argue why this is unique and perhaps unparalleled in the recent history of India. Uh, I'm going to quickly go over the backdrop to highlight how this agitation reached where it is. And before I do that, I'm going to just give you some facts about India and India's agricultural situation to contextualize what I'm going to talk about. India has roughly 650,000 villages. The average size of a land holding is very small. It's barely about 2.5 acres, which is just a little over 1 hectare, or to put it more simply, uh, it's about the size of a soccer field, a football field. And roughly half of these holdings are really, really small. That means they're below 1 and 2 hectares, and there are small and marginal farmers. And approximately half the population who live in the rural parts of, of our country is landless. Land is a very, very scarce resource in India. And just to give you one set of figures, India accounts for a little under 18% of the population of planet Earth. But less than 2.5% of the land area of the world is in India, the nation state called India. Now, roughly half of the total land area in India, I beg your pardon, not land area, the cultivable area in India is what is called rain fed. That means the other half receives a short supply of water or irrigation, but the other half is dependent on the monsoons. I don't want to get into the monsoons, but India has hundreds and thousands of gods. The god of rain is Indra Bhagwan. And everybody from the poorest farmer on the field to the Minister of Finance in Delhi pray to Lord Indra. And it was like a long, long time ago, perhaps almost 100 years ago, that a phrase was coined that the budget of India is a gamble on the monsoon. Be that as it may, there is some aspects of Indian agriculture and the Indian economy which makes India different from most other countries in the world. In most other countries in the world, in most countries in the world, over time, as a country, quote unquote, develops economically, and I use the word develops in quotes, the share of agriculture comes down as a share of the national income or the gross domestic product. But so does the share of the population depending directly or indirectly on agriculture. So I can talk about the difference between the US and India. There are fewer farmers in the United States of America than the number of persons behind bars. But those estimates vary. But people would say certainly half, some would say 60% of the population of India, which is about over 1.3 billion, about to touch 1.4 billion. India is soon going to overtake China as the most populous country on the planet, are directly, their livelihoods directly dependent, or directly or indirectly dependent on agriculture. So what makes India unique? And this is really a structural issue. Though the share of agriculture in India's economy, India's national income, India's gross domestic product has shrunk over the years, the share of the population depending directly or indirectly on agriculture has not shrunk commensurately. And I'll just give you some ballpark figures. India became politically independent in 1947, right through the decade of the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. The share of agriculture in India's national income was roughly 70%. And this includes the time India went through a period which was called the ship to mouth period, where we would get wheat from the United States when Lyndon Johnson was the president of the US, and India got a lot of grain under what is called PL 480, Public Law 480. And India went through what is often described as a ship to mouth situation. And in the course of the late 60s and early 70s, India became a self-sufficient in agriculture, and that's a longer story. I obviously wouldn't be able to tell you everything over a period of in the limited time that I have. So if the share of agriculture in India's GDP was consistently at around 70%, right, from the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, it thereafter started shrinking gradually. And by it started shrinking to a situation where right now agriculture is barely 15%, 14 to 15% of India's GDP. But the share of the population dependent on agriculture has hardly come down. It was 70% through the 50s and the 60s. By the later part of the century, the previous century, it had come down from 70% to about 55%. It came down to 45 to 50% where it is now. Some people say this is again an underestimate, the proportion of the population directly dependent on agriculture. Some people would say that it's closer to 60%, but there is absolutely no dispute about the fact that at least half the population of India depends directly, indirectly on agriculture. Their livelihoods depend on agriculture. So that is the big picture that I wanted to place before you before I come down to the specifics. And before I move to the specifics, you also need to know that there have been particular parts of India, the northern part of India, the state of Punjab, the state of Haryana, parts of western Uttar Pradesh, that have really been often described as the grain bowl of India. And one of the reasons why India became self-sufficient in food grain is because this part of India, the productivity of wheat cultivation, rice cultivation went up manyfold through the 70s and continued through the 80s. That also created its own set of problems about which we can talk about later. Now, because of the limitations of time, I'm going to go very quickly over the main points, and I'll be happy to take questions as we move on. Now, we're looking at 3 laws that were first moved in the form of an ordinance, and they were moved on the 5th of June of 2020. An ordinance is a legal instrument which is often used in an emergency situation or a situation when prevalent laws are supposed to be inadequate or even absent. That's why, according to the Constitution of India, an ordinance has to be converted into a law or allowed to lapse altogether. So, by their very nature, an ordinance is a short-term measure, and it's not supposed to be used for long-term or more fundamental changes, which actually have a lot to do with the Constitution. However, the laws what became laws and acts started off as ordinances. So, as I mentioned, you're looking here at a huge population. If your total population is close to 1.4 billion or 1.35 or 1.36, you're looking at roughly 700 million people. They produce about 1 billion tons or over 1 billion tons of a wide range of agricultural produce. I mean, a whole lot of things. Now, why do I go back to the 5th of June 2020? Because something very, very important. I mean, that was the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. The load of the pandemic had doubled from about 100,000 in the middle of May to over 200,000. This was the same period of time. This was the time there was aggression from China along India's borders in the north, in the east. There was hostility. Significantly, on the 24th of March, a lockdown was announced with little or no notice, which resulted in a huge internal migration, largely from the cities to the rural areas. And there was also a lot of human distress that took place. And many of us believe that this was arguably not just the biggest internal migration of people in the history of India, it's perhaps in the history of humankind. That's another subject. Now, the all India nationwide lockdown crippled and closed almost every kind of economic activity, except, interestingly, agriculture. In fact, if you go even by the government of India's figures, and many people question those figures, in the months of April, May, and June 2020, India's economy came down, shrank by almost a fourth. The official data of the government of India says it's 23.9%. And we saw a sharp fall. And the next quarter, that's after India's financial year starts in April. So it's April, May, June, and then July, August, September, according to the government of India, the economy shrank by about 7.5%. So you actually saw, for the first time in living memory, India went through what is called a technical recession, US style, in the sense you had recession, you had negative growth for 2 successive quarters. This is interesting because during this period, food grain production continued to grow. And the Prime Minister announced a major scheme to provide food grain and pulses, 5 kilograms of wheat or rice per person and 1 kilograms of pulses per household, to support about 800 million beneficiaries of a public distribution system. It was announced first in March 2020 for a 3-month period, and then it was extended till November, and it's still continuing. We are not sure how long it will continue, though. That's another that's another piece. Okay, so it was during this period that these 3 laws became the 3 ordinances became laws. It was also a time when Parliament was hardly in session, and before these became laws, the opposition complained that they were not being allowed to speak. 8 members of Parliament, all belonging to opposition parties, on the 21st of August, which happened to be the 20th of August, they were suspended. They were accused of unruly behavior, tearing papers, intimidating the head of the House, and they were suspended the following day, and they were protesting on the lawns outside Parliament. And it was really, they claimed that their voice was not heard, and that the laws were rushed through, and they were not given adequate time to give their comments and their criticism of the laws. Now, I'm going to give you the 3 laws and give you the gist of what these laws were. And they have very, very long names, so you will please excuse me. Law number 1, the Farmers' Produce, Trade and Commerce, Promotion and Facilitation Act 1. Number 2, the Farmers' Empowerment and Protection Agreement of Price Assurance and Farm Services Act, number 2. Number 3, the Essential Commodities Amendment Act. Now, I'm going to elaborate on all these 3 acts in greater detail, but I must first sort of make a very brief submission. I'm not going to get into great detail on them, but I'm just going to give you the gist. And I'm going to try and give you both sides of the story and why there's been so much opposition to what happened. Okay, so let's start with the first law. I mean, India has a federal constitution, and agriculture is a state stroke provincial subject. That means each state, and India has 28 states and 7 what are called union territories, which are akin to the American federally administered territories. So they are all supposed to have the autonomy to devise their own laws. The actual practice is a little more complicated. And because these laws also deal with movement of food products from one state to the other. The central government comes in. Now, there is a huge dispute about whether this has actually weakened the federal structure and the constitutional structure of India, but we leave that discussion at some other point of time. Okay, so the first law is, it is said, the government says it's going to help farmers because farmers choose the markets where they sell. They will sell at the farm gate or to a cold storage unit, to a warehouse or a processing unit in their own area, their own state, or outside it. It gives them that freedom. And they don't have to pay levies and cesses on the sale of produce and bear unusually high transport expenses. And the markets would thereby be forced to become more competitive. This is really the free market logic that is used. Whereas many people argue that across the world, including in the United States, agricultural markets are never free. That farmers receive huge amounts of money by way of subsidies and grants from the federal government. Yeah, there are these old stories about farmers in the US. 5% of less than 5%. I think it's 2% of America's population receive enough farm subsidies when you look at about half the rest of the world's population. Another statistic is that the amount of money, the subsidy that the average cow gets in the European Union would enable that cow to fly business class once across the globe. These are, well, you can sort of, I could carry on, but I won't get into those details. But the counter to the law was, or why it hurt farmers and why they are unhappy, is that they actually believe that this is notional, that they are not really free to sell anywhere they like. And they're forced to sell below what is supposed to be a minimum support price. I'm going to come to this issue of the minimum support price because it's very, very important. It also said that these markets are not really free, that there are cartels that operate, and these really big buyers, what Amitabha's breed of economists would call monopsonists. Few buyers would control prices. And you would find because of their domination, they would buy at a low price, be able to store it at a higher price, and then so store it for a period of time, and therefore sell it at a higher price. Now, the farmers have been thinking that it is going to end what is called a minimum support price regime. The minimum support price regime is a regime which the government, it's not really a perfect regime. There are lots of problems. It's been, there is a body called the Agricultural Prices Commission, oh sorry, it's called the CACP, the Commission on Agricultural Costs and Prices, which recommends minimum support prices for 23 crops. Now, how this is calculated is again a very, very contentious issue. But the main point to note is that it really works for two parts of India and works very well. And these are for rice and wheat, grown in what I earlier described as the grain bowl. So about 70% of the rice that is produced in this part of India is procured at the minimum support price. And about 40 to 50% of the wheat is also procured at this price. Now, these are the biggest operations. This has created its own problems. Many people believe that these parts of India shouldn't be growing rice, which is a water-intensive crop. Similarly, sugarcane is grown in parts of India which are, it has been argued it should not be grown because they are also water-guzzling crops. And these have also created their own set of ecological concerns, the lowering of the groundwater level, the excessive use of chemical fertilizers have resulted in soil, the condition of soil deteriorating, and because of excessive drawal of power, water, underground water, often thanks to free electricity, we've seen the water table and the aquifers getting depleted and coming down. That's a series of issues. And in fact, when environmental activists like Greta Thunberg and others have been criticizing the government of India. The government of India is saying, you are environmentally conscious, you want to support farmers who are practicing agriculture in an ecologically unsustainable manner. Anyway, these are all very complex issues, many issues, and I don't want to get into it because at best I'll be able to I'm just going to touch the surface of it. So now, then this whole issue is that of the Essential Commodities Act. Okay, no, let me take it two steps back. What these laws essentially do, they when you put them all together, they allow unlimited farming of any agricultural produce by a so-called sponsor. Now, who is the sponsor? And this is really the apprehension that the farmers have. These are big businesses. These are some of the biggest corporate conglomerates. So that's one part of the story. The other is the stocking part of it. By removing all stocking limits, essentially, you are modifying an act which is as old as me, and Amitabha. It is the Essential Commodities Act of 1955. And therefore, what happens is that you remove those limits, the stocking limits. Now, when you look at it, these apply really to about 24 odd produce. But farming is much more than that. Farming is poultry, farming is fishing, farming is growing goats. Goats. Goats are one part of it. There's horticulture, there's piggery, there's goatery, there's vegetables, there's fruits. So agriculture is not just cereals. Though a lot of the dispute today is because the farmers that are agitating, they're protesting, they come from areas which are the biggest producers of rice and wheat, the two most widely consumed cereals. Okay, so I'm going to go on. I'm sorry if I'm sort of moving back and forth on occasions, but essentially the government says that the amendment to the Essential Commodities Act would attract new investments, corporate investments, foreign investments. The food supply chain would get improved. You know, about a fifth of the food that's consumed in India rots. It's complete wastage at a time when, there are people who don't get enough to eat. India has large sections of India's population, you could argue, is undernourished, even malnourished. But the point is, they're saying that the supply chain investment would improve, the cold storage situation would, better storage facilities would reduce wastage. But the opposition says, the protesters say, that these extraordinary circumstances, the fine print, when do you trigger? When do you say there is hoarding? When do you say there is excessive price fluctuation? Is it the way stock markets operate? These are really the contention that happened because, and you could argue that one of the reasons the farmers are so unhappy today is because agriculture has become so risky. It's become such a risky profession for half the population. So when there's a good crop, there's a bumper crop, prices come down and the farmers don't benefit to the extent that they would, say, in a lean year. When there is a shortfall of production, in order to keep the prices from going up, the government or government bodies or private players, they start importing at a lower price to stabilize the price. So they don't get the benefit of high prices when they have a good crop. But when prices fall, they also, and what happens is imports come in, cheap imports come in. So it's a lose-lose situation for them. They don't gain in any kind of a situation. So this is maybe an oversimplification, but it gives you a big picture or the perception of what is happening. Now, I'll move on and talk a little bit about one of the most controversial and contentious parts of it, which even the government has agreed. Now, under the new laws, disputes have been taken out of the civil code and the criminal procedure codes and given to administrative authorities and conciliation and arbitration boards, which have been constituted by the government and largely comprises civil servants or bureaucrats, government officials. Now, this is something that has been opposed because what the farmers and those who are agitating saying that the officers appointed by the government tend to invariably favor the government. The law, the judiciary, yes, litigation is expensive, it is time consuming, but sometimes they're a little less partisan in favor of the government or the administration. Just as India has not done a great job in balancing, the interests of the farmer with that of the consumer, so too it's not done such a great job in balancing, how much should go through the legal process and how much should go through the administrative process. This is something that, again, one can talk about in great detail, but the short point is that we haven't done a great job. Inflation, when prices go up, it impacts the poor because the poor spend a larger proportion of their income on food. And not only does it impact the poor, it automatically widens inequalities, therefore, the gap between the rich and the poor. And that's what's happened in India in recent years. Our billionaires are really billionaires even by American standards. If you go to the Forbes list and the Fortune list, there's at least one Indian entrepreneur, India's richest man. Amitabh mentioned a book, I've written a book about this person. So the point is not about this person, his conglomerate. So the point is the minimum support price. The government keeps saying that we're not doing away with the minimum support price, but there seems to be a trust deficit because the farmers tend to think of it as a worst case scenario, that they'll be completely left at the mercy of big corporates. And if they are denied this kind of statutory support in the form of a minimum price, it's akin to the statutory support that minimum wages, for factory workers. They don't get provident fund, they don't get bonus, they don't get gratuity, they don't get a whole lot of benefits that industrial workers do. Now, you see, India is, as I told you, largely rural. But India is also getting is urbanized. So if 60% of your population is rural and largely dependent on agriculture for livelihood, you still have 40% living in the cities and the urban areas. So I can actually talk in great detail on each of these laws, but I don't think I have the time, and I don't think all of you might be equally interested in everything. But the point is, and these are an important point, and these are based on facts, and I'm willing to share. The last agricultural census was held about 6 years ago. It says even in the agriculturally most prosperous parts of India, like the state of Punjab, about a third are small and marginal farmers, and another third are medium to large. And they are the main cultivators. Now, the share of farm laborers in total agricultural workforce was about 40% in 91, and it rose to about 55% in 2011. This is all government figures. But we've also seen job losses. We've also seen that between 2011 and 2017, 18, something in the region of about 30 million farm workers lost their jobs in rural India. We've seen large numbers of farmers who've committed suicide, and they run into literally hundreds of thousands. I have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to just give you the big picture once again. So, the government of India is saying that these farmers are misguided. They are being influenced by those who want a separate state for Punjab, Khalistan, as it's called. The government of India claims that the farmers are being influenced by left wing extremists. They are saying that, look, they are misguided. They are being doing what they are at the behest of people who want a civil war in India. On 11 occasions, groups of farmers have met government representatives, not the Prime Minister. Though the Prime Minister once said he's just a phone call away, he hasn't met them. It's really his top ministers, and including the Agriculture Minister. On a number of occasions, the farmers came to India. New Delhi is one of New Delhi's fanciest conference venues, a place called Vigyan Bhavan. There is science center, if you like, loosely translated. Uh, and they refused to eat the food that the government offered, refused to drink the tea. They said, we'll bring our own food. It reached a stage where at the end of it, the ministers ate the food that had been given by the farmers. Yes, the farmers, one of the other things on which the government is very, very critical about, he said this is being dominated by a group of relatively rich farmers concentrated in the state of Punjab, which is dominated by people who subscribe to the Sikh faith, if you like. They're the ones who grow their hair long, they wear turbans. But the point is, yes, the government, one of the present ruling party, the right-wing Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party, is one of his oldest alliance partners parted ways with it, the Shiromani Akali Dal, SAD. The government is saying this is confined to just a few farmers from a few areas. The farmers, those who are agitating, they are saying that we represent over 40 organizations, and they come from all over the country. Uh, it's really become attitudes on both sides seem to have hardened. I would say at least 100,000 people have continued to camp 100 days. I mean, come winter, rain, now it gets very, very hot in Delhi in the coming months. It will get very, very hot. I personally haven't seen any signs of conciliation as of now. Yes, over the 100 days, a lot of the momentum has maybe receded a bit. Farmers saying, repeal the laws and we'll talk. Government is saying, we are agreeing to postpone the implementation of the laws for 1.5 years. Let's talk. They're not talking. So, on both sides, attitudes have hardened. What has actually surprised, I mean, one of the reasons why the government has been talking such a lot is because a very large section of the farmers who are agitating, their children serve on the armed forces, India's army. So I go back to where I started really, Lal Bahadur Shastri's Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, hail the soldier, hail the farmer. So a whole lot of issues have got conflated, and we see today a very substantial section of the farming community in northern India very, very angry with what the government did, not consulting them before moving these laws, which are going to have far reaching consequences on their livelihoods, and without consultation, by literally trying to, because the government or the ruling party has a majority, they're sort of just going ahead with it. They're saying you should have talked to us. I mean, even the Supreme Court of India says you should have pre-legislative consultation. So attitudes seem to have hardened on both sides, and I'm not really sure where it's going to go. In the next few months, we are having elections in a number of important provinces or states, including the one from where Amitabh and I come from, that's Bengal. It's become a very, it's become politics. It's all about politics. There was an agitation on the 26th of January, Republic Day. There are claims, counterclaims. Within the media, too, there's a sharp polarization of opinion. And the farmers actually have started their own newspaper and their own website because they believe the media has not given them their view adequately. The internet was completely shut down. You know, India leads the world in internet shutdowns. Among the places where the internet would shut down were these places, the 3 townships where the farmers were agitating. They are annadatas. They are the ones who provide you food on the table. So they matter. Though many Indians don't eat on a table, they sit on the ground and they eat. They eat with their hands, of course. But it matters that these are the people who provide you food. It's very emotional. I've met people who support Modi, the Prime Minister, India's Prime Minister, but who said what he's doing is not right. I've met people from the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh who say this is not the way forward. So I don't know what's going to happen in the foreseeable future. So far, the protests, barring a few isolated incidents, have been incredibly peaceful. In fact, when the police persons, when the security people come, they are offered food. They said, your parents, your relatives are also farmers. Come and eat with us. The counter view is saying, look, they're getting big bucks. Where are they getting the money from? So the attitudes on both sides have hardened. It seems the government is refusing to repeal the laws. Time alone will tell what will happen. But I conclude my talk by saying this is arguably the biggest challenge that India's government, headed by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has faced since it came to power in May 2014. For the first time in May 2014, the government came to power. For the first time in 30 years, it has a majority. First, it was a coalition, and now the ruling party has a majority. But this, in my opinion, this agitation by farmers is really the biggest challenge that Narendra Modi's government has faced so far and is currently facing. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm honored and privileged to be able to speak with you. I've sort of moved back and forth and perhaps oversimplified some points and jumped from here and there, but I guess I couldn't. I mean, it's a very complex subject. That's all I can say. I'll be happy. I mean, there's a lot of information in the public domain. I'll be happy to engage with individuals if some of you are more interested and if you have specific questions for me. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Paranjoy. I really enjoyed learning a lot more about the protests than I had been gathering from the media. So maybe the farmers are right. A lot of the information is not getting out there. I wanted to use my sort of privilege as the discussant to ask the first question, and then I will open it up to others. I have a lot of questions, so if there aren't others, I will continue to go. Okay, at the beginning of your talk, you spoke about a lot of structural factors, or at least that's what we tend to call them, sort of land mass and arable land and water and population, etc. What that led me to start thinking about was just the idea that maybe some sort of clash like this was actually inevitable. So I wanted to ask you, is this something that had to happen, Modi or no Modi? Or is there something about the current administration that sort of teed this up at this moment in time?
Yeah. Shall I react to what you said, Megan? Oh, sorry, Susan. Susan, sorry.
Yes, well, I think we'll go one at a time unless if there's somebody else who has
No,
a tag-along question.
okay. You know, the farm crisis or the crisis of farming in India did not start yesterday or day before. It's been there for several decades, but the problems have worsened, in my view, gradually right through the 80s, the 90s, and the first decade of the new millennium, and now the second decade as well. What was really the tipping point? Farming was always a highly risky business. Farmers were always complaining that they were not getting a fair deal, that they would fall deep into debt and they wouldn't have a way forward. I mean, hundreds of thousands of farmers have committed suicide across the country in the last few decades. I mean, these numbers again would vary, but I would say in the last 20 years, certainly 300,000, maybe more than 400,000. So that many families have there at least one member who committed suicide because they were unable to repay debts, because they saw absolutely bleak future. Now again, it's contentious. People have give different point of view. Was it inevitable? In my opinion, there were problems that were festering. Now, what was really the tipping point, or what were the series of circumstances that resulted 100 days ago for at least 200,000 farmers to start agitating? In my opinion, it was the way the laws were enacted, first through an ordinance and then through through parliament, but in a manner in which there was general agreement that the opposition wasn't given enough time to voice their view. So it was perceived as a government with a majority ramming it down the throats of people, where it could have a huge impact, not only on the part of India, which is the most agriculturally prosperous part of India, literally the granary of India, the grain bowl of India, but had the potential of impacting the livelihoods of large numbers of people. They feel that there was inadequate consultation. That was, in my opinion, Hugh. And then the third factor was the fact that one of the Bharatiya Janata Party, the ruling right-wing Hindu nationalist party's oldest ally, the Shiromani Akali Dal, decides to quit the government. Its ministers resign and they say, no, we can't take this. The third factor is the opposition against the conglomerates led by the two richest men in India. They're seeing the government as indirectly helping the interests of large corporations at their expense. And in my opinion, another factor which kind of made things, which kind of in a sense made the protesters even more determined, was the way it was handled. I mean, at midnight in winter, you're using water cannons. And so I would say a combination of these factors resulted in the agitation becoming what it is. So yes, there were structural factors, there were long-term factors. I mean, these problems were there in the previous government, but it never reached this stage. And in my opinion, the reasons why it reached the stage that it did was the factors that I've enumerated. I stop.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I believe Julia is next.
Great. Thank you so much for this really, really helpful contextualizing talk. It's really, like Susan, helped me make sense of what's going on in a new way. So I have a question that might initially seem sort of silly and obvious, but I'm going to ask it anyways, which is, you gave us all this great contextualizing statistical information about the number of people who depend on agriculture for a living in India. And then these protests have largely been framed as a farmer protest, and the people doing it identify as farmers. They have organizations that have names like the Kisan Ekta Morcha, like these kinds of things. And I guess my question is, does the category of farmer in these protests include everybody who is dependent on agriculture, or is it a subset of folks? And from whose perspective, does the government have a different perspective than the protesting organizations? And then to follow from that, are these protests driving any kind of shifts in solidarity across different types of folks who are dependent on agriculture, across landowners and laborers? Is the category of farmer at play in these protests right now?
Okay, it's not an easy question that you raised, Julia. Yes, the point is, even those who farm, or at least a section, at least some of them, they don't derive their livelihood is not entirely dependent on agriculture. I mean, in a family, say, of 5 members, there could be a few who'd be focused entirely on cultivation. Somebody could be a soldier. Somebody could be a trader. Somebody else could be something else. So that is one aspect of this thing. But I would say that a very substantial portion of those who've been agitating, I would say about 250,000 of them, they come from families that are largely cultivating land. In fact, the agitation was at its peak because that was a time when the harvesting was at a relatively low ebb, and there would be some members of the family that would come back and forth. And yes, there were workers' unions, there were others. We are seeing changes also. Yes, you can say there have been at least 40 odd unions and associations at the forefront of this agitation. We've seen the emergence of new leaders. We've seen people who are articulating the situation in words and in language we've not seen before, or certainly not seen in recent times. Therefore, there is expressions of solidarity, not only with senior citizens, with women, with children, with factory workers. But again, the situation is a fairly complex situation. Why? What do you do with a fertilizer factory? What do you do with the workers of the fertilizer factory? I mean, would you say that their livelihood is directly or is it indirectly dependent on agriculture? What do you do with the family of people who are owning trucks and lorries, who are transporting the food grain? I mean, we have a very, very unusual situation in India, and this is something a lot of people don't realize. The government puts out what are called buffer stock limits. In terms of the government calculates what is a safe limit. For the last few years, the Food Corporation of India, which is the government of India's, which really, when you talk about rice and wheat and operating and ensuring that farmers get the minimum support price, the Food Corporation of India is really the player. The FCI, or the Food Corporation of India, for the last several years, the amount of wheat and rice it has is between 3 and 4 times what is considered to be a safe buffer stock. So in certain commodities, you have much, much more today than what you need. You actually have a problem of plenty. And the problem is that of ensuring wastage. You want rats and rodents to eat up most of it. You want to ensure that they're stored properly. And again, then the question is, should the food corporation be privatized? What should be the role of the government? What should be the role of the private sector? And these are debates that have been going on, not today, for several decades. But all of these kind of conflates. But what we are today seeing is something very unusual. The government saying, 1.5 years, we are not going to implement the laws. And the representatives of 40 odd institutions of farmers saying, repeal the laws, scrap those laws, then we'll talk. Hardening of attitudes. So we've gone beyond debating the merits or the demerits of whether you want the new Essential Commodities Act, where you want a new kind of contract farming with corporates, what should be futures pricing and so on and so forth, what should be the way in which movement of agricultural goods should be allowed. It's become very, very politically emotional. You know, and both sides are saying, are appealing to people's emotions. That you, Prime Minister, how many people from your community are fighting in the cold borders in the Himalayas against those who from China allegedly infiltrating into our territory? Who are you to tell us, we are protecting our borders, we are providing you food. These are the kind of emotional kind of language that we are seeing on both sides. And as I mentioned earlier, I gave you that example. Initially, the farmers refused to eat the food that the government was giving them. And finally, the government said, we'll eat your food, bring your food along. And these meetings, these 11 meetings would last for hours and hours and hours. And they're saying, why are you talking to us? First, repeal the laws. Okay, I've tried to answer your question, Julia.
Excellent, thank you so much. I believe, Nikhil, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Thakurta, for this talk. It is really helpful to sort of sift through all the media representations of these laws. My question is about the BJP, and it's one of the dreaded two-parters, so please forgive me.
Sorry?
The first question. Sorry.
I didn't hear the last sentence of what you said, Nikhil Menon.
Yes. What I was saying is that I have a two-part question, so please forgive me for that. But it's about the BJP. My first question is, what is the current economic ideology of the BJP? The reason I ask that is because the way I see it, there's been sort of three iterations of what the BJP's economic philosophy has been. As you suggested to earlier, the RSS has had a sort of anti-globalization, Swadeshi, kind of, as it used to be called derisively, communism plus cow, right? That used to be the idea of what the RSS's economic view was. There has been recently also, as we saw with demonetization, an anti-technocratic, anti-expert way of conducting the economy, with demonetization being something that most economists panned. At the same time, since the 1990s, we've also seen under Vajpayee onwards, a move towards market orthodoxy. So which wing of the Sangh Parivar is on the ascendant in these set of farm laws? Is it pro-corporate? Is it intention, therefore, with the RSS's roots in a sort of Swadeshi philosophy? So that's my first question. The second one is very brief, which is, do you think that these farm ordinances and now laws were propelled by economic considerations or political considerations? Because we've seen often that the Narendra Modi government has privileged political considerations over economic ones, but I cannot see the political upside to what seems to have been really a move that's blown up in their face.
Very, very good questions, Nikhil, you've asked. As a student of the political economy of India and the world, I always wonder how far you can separate politics from economics. I've always believed that, in the short term, or it appears politics is dominating economics and economics, or vice versa. But I think it doesn't take too long for the two strands to merge. So the second question of yours is, it's both. When you look at the economy of India, continuously over the last 3 years, and this is before the lockdown, you found the rate of growth of India's economy slowing down. And then for the first time since statistics were compiled in India, India entered into recession. I've never agreed entirely with the American definition of recession, which is negative growth for 2 successive quarters. But India went into a technical, quote unquote, technical recession for the first time in the 6 months between April, May, June, July, August, September 2020. That's point number one. Now, where does politics come in? It comes in all the time. You talked about demonetization, where literally overnight, Mr. Narendra Modi's government declared illegal about 84% of the currency in circulation. in November 2016. Remember, it was soon followed by elections to Uttar Pradesh. Yeah, in Uttar Pradesh. And Uttar Pradesh is India's most populous state. It is a huge state. About 1 out of 6 Indians live in Uttar Pradesh. If Uttar Pradesh was an independent nation state, it would have been the sixth most populous country on planet Earth after China, India without Uttar Pradesh, Indonesia, United States, Brazil. It's bigger than Pakistan in terms of people. So UP was huge. So despite the hardship that it caused to large sections of the population, Narendra Modi's popularity remained untouched because the Bharatiya Janata Party swept the polls in Uttar Pradesh. The poor saw it or perceived demonetization as a period of sacrifice, perceived it as a move that would hurt the rich more than the poor. Though many people would argue that the reverse was true, but the perceptions were such. After demonetization, there was a rush through goods and services tax. Again, many people say it ruined the economy. Manmohan Singh, the former Prime Minister of India, said when demonetization happened that it would cut off 2% of India's GDP, and it actually has. He's been proved right. He was prescient. And then the third, and arguably one of the most, I mean, India went through one of the harshest lockdowns on planet Earth. On the 24th of March, people were not even given 3 hours of notice when they think everything is shut down. No buses, no trains. Look, I mean, the documentation is still going on. The government of India told the Supreme Court of India there's not a single migrant laborer on the highways. And here are others who say millions, not millions, tens of millions of people migrated. It was the biggest internal migration, certainly in India. And many people would say in the history of the world. Now, I can go on and on about this, but when you come to the RSS and the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is the ideological parent of the Bharatiya Janata Party, although it's a so-called social organization, and it has espoused the whole issue of Swadeshi. But today, Mr. Modi is talking about Atmanirbharta, self-sufficiency, self-reliance. It was Arun Shourie, now a bitter critic of the government, a former minister in Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee's government, who actually called the BJP the Congress with a cow. I'm being precise in the use of quotations. What is its current economic ideology? At one level, you can say it's populist. Free food, free gas cylinders up to a point, toilets, build toilets, open bank accounts, digitize. On the other side, privatization. Unlike previous governments, including the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government, which talks about strategic sales of government-owned or public sector undertakings, this government has not been shy of it. It's been talking about privatization. In the month of May, the finance minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, she put out a package which says this is a relief package which is equal to about 10% of India's GDP. India's GDP was at one point of time about roughly 200 lakh crores, but that is 2 followed by 12 zeros. Okay, I'm bad at converting it into US dollars. But the short point is that when you looked at the figures, out of that huge number, which you said was a relief package, 10% of GDP, the actual additional part of it, the new part of it, was barely 1/10 of that number. So it was actually the relief package was about 2% of GDP and not 10% of GDP, 2% at best. The rest were old schemes recycled. So what is BJP's current economic ideology? I would say right of center, pro big business. I mean, Rahul Gandhi has gone to the extent of taking a slogan which was used for families way back in the 70s. Hum do, hamare do. We too, we have to. husband, wife, 2 children, into what Narendra Modi's government, hum do hamare do, meaning Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Home Minister, which is equivalent to the Internal Security Minister, is Amit Shah, 2 most powerful people in India. Hamare do, 2 of us, the 2 richest men in India, the corporate conglomerates led by Mr. Mukesh Ambani and Mr. Gautam Adani. So we've seen kind of centralization of power, both political power and economic power, in ways in which we've not seen in recent times. So I think I've tried to answer your question. It calls for a far longer conversation, but I would like to conflate both the political parts of it and the economic parts of it. As I mentioned earlier, in 2014, after a gap of 30 years, India went through a phase of coalitions. We had a party with a majority in the lower house of parliament, and that majority went up. And the way India works is first past the post, and then winner takes all, unlike in the US where winner first takes all. But we had the BJP itself improving its vote share, and also the NDA improving its vote share, and voter turnout was huge, over 2/3. And you must remember, India is a very young population. Out of 1.35, 1.4 billion people in India, about half is below the age of 26 or 27. India's median age is 27. Some of us think within the next few years, we'll have more people in India than in the People's Republic of China. So you're talking about the young people also. So when we talk, I'm sorry, this is kind of, I'm digressing a little bit from what I was telling you, but all these factors make it such that it's not easy to categorize an economic ideology of a party. I mean, even when we talk about words like capitalism and communism and socialism, these are very, very loaded terms. And especially when you try and apply those terms to a really vast and a very, very diverse country like India. I mean, I'm saying things which a lot of people know. We are the only country in the world with 17 languages on our currency note, and 21 languages in the 8th schedule of the Constitution of India, excluding the language I'm using right now to speak with you, Mr. Nikhil Menon.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're nearly running out of time, but I want to give a chance to ask the 2 remaining questions. So why don't we have Will and Amitabha ask their questions, and if you could give us a brief answer, that would be fantastic.
Thank you so much for your talk today. It was very insightful. A topic that I honestly haven't, learned much about. But my question pertains to the mass migration and the camps outside Delhi, for example, that you mentioned. How have these possibly exacerbated the effects of the pandemic, and how will they continue to affect the vaccination rollout? I know that India has recently developed their own homegrown vaccination, and how will this affect going forward? And what are the prospects for widespread vaccination?
Because of the sheer numbers involved, I'm not an expert on the subject to give you very clear and definite answers. The vaccination drive has begun. It's going to be huge. How effective? It's really something I'm not capable or competent to really answer. All I can say is the mass migration that really took place in the months from the night of the 24th of March, or you can say from the end of March, all the way through and continued right through April, May, and June of 2020, had to end somewhere. And it did. As the lockdown was gradually lifted, as transportation facilities came up, as those who had left their homes in rural India in the first place to migrate to cities because there were inadequate livelihood or job opportunities in their own place, there was a reverse migration too that happened. And this was an unusual migration where it was not just people moving from one geographical area to another. Even within smaller geographical areas, there was a movement away from urban to rural areas. So yes, These are all linked, all connected, but connecting all those dots is not easy. Even today, the government is refusing to disclose the total number of people who died during the migration. Though the Supreme Court of India was told by the Union Home Secretary there's not a single migrant. In my opinion, it was a lie. And it's a lie when you have one of the top officials saying this to the highest court of this country. And I'm using strong language, but I seriously believe it. So we are actually living in a post-truth world. We don't know many things. We guess many things, but we are not sure. I mean, as in your country, in my country, disinformation is rife. I mean, for both sides, what are the facts? How accurate, how credible are those facts? It's something that we have been debating and we will continue to debate. And just this whole issue, how many people actually left? How many people died? At best, we have what are called guesstimates. But we know the government of India, and many people don't believe the figures of the government of India. But just what the government of India tells you is that India's economy shrank in the months of April, May, and June by almost a quarter, 23.9%, almost 24%, and the following quarter by another 7.5%. And now again, there is a dispute as to whether the financial year that ends on the 31st of this month, we'll see the economy shrink by 10% or 8% or 12%. To talk about how India calculates statistics is another story altogether. But the point is, the lockdown impacted the informal sector. And what is the informal or the unorganized sector? They provide livelihoods to 90% of the working population of India, more than 90% of the population. It accounts for roughly half of our economy. And statistics on this sector are often delayed and often inadequate, and often based on extrapolation, which is not very accurate. And I really can't give you a meaningful answer on the vaccination drive and the COVID vaccination drive that's currently happening in India. I really shouldn't open my mouth because I don't know enough to tell you. But what's begun is something on a huge scale, and it's just begun. It's just begun. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Last but not least, Amitabha.
Thank you, Paranjoy, for a very illuminating overview and dissection of what's going on. I wanted to ask you two related questions. One is, political economy is not just about winning elections, it's also about financing elections, connections between the government and corporates or big business or whatever you call it. So where does that fit into the farm story? Because you mentioned that the change would actually benefit some of these business houses, and I've even read about this in the press. The related question is something that is probably very dear to your heart, which is how do you see the press and the government relating to each other? I was so horrified when the Kashmir thing happened, how most of the press was just completely silent over what was going on. But now there seems to be a little more little more vocal about some of these things. Yet there are threats, as Nita pointed out, of intellectuals being sent to jail. And I wonder if there are similar threats to journalists as well.
Amitabha, both the questions that you've raised merit long discussions.
Right.
It's very, 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 very difficult to give you short answers to those questions. We know that traditionally, the funding of political parties, the funding of election campaigns, the funding of those who stand for elections in India has been extremely opaque. At a time when many people felt that we were moving towards greater transparency, greater disclosures, under the present government, they introduced a scheme of electoral bonds, which, in my opinion, and I'm not alone, many people believe, made the election system, the political funding system, even less transparent and more opaque. So yes, to say that there is a very substantial part of the Indian economy which is not accounted for, that it's black or gray at best, is a no-brainer. To say that business houses are funding political parties and politicians is again a no-brainer. Except we don't know them. I dare say that the Indian political funding system is far, far less transparent than the American system. That's only a very, very short answer. This is a huge subject. And I mean, I could suggest people who are far more competent than I am, but this is something that calls for a seminar that could last for at least a few hours. On your second question is something very, very close to my heart. As a person, I've been a journalist practicing for over 4 decades, 43 years to be precise. I became a journalist in the mid-70s, in the late 70s actually, for the first time in the history of India, between June 1975 and January and February 1977, Indira Gandhi imposed an emergency. The right to free speech was drastically curtailed. Journalists were put behind bars. I dare say we have a new kind of emergency today. It's the death by 1,000 cuts. I would say today we find a larger section of the so-called mainstream media that includes newspapers, magazines. India is the only country in the world that describes itself as a democracy, where news and current affairs programs on radio is still a monopoly of the government. And now the way in which the government is trying to control the online media, the social media, the news media, I dare say never since the mid-70s, and I could argue in certain respects it's worse than the mid-70s when you and I were students in college and university, has such a large section of the media in India become so subservient to those who are in positions of power and authority. It's never happened. That such a small section of the mainstream media in India, or the social media, or the online media, is really trying to hold truth to power, trying to ask difficult questions of those who are in power, and you know, trying to hold them accountable, trying to ensure there's greater transparency in public life, greater accountability, less abuse of discretionary powers. This is a subject on which I could talk to you all night. But Amitabha, we have limited time. This is a subject very, very close to my heart. And I can literally, I'm not exaggerating, I can talk nonstop for 2 hours and spend 2 more hours answering your questions. We leave that for another day.
Excellent. Thank you so much for, first of all, a really enlightening talk and for a really lively question and answer period. I learned just as much from the latter portion as from the former, so that's fantastic. I also just wanted to thank you for attending on your Friday evening at a time when maybe you would prefer to be doing other things. So thank you so much. I also just wanted to briefly let everybody else know I entered into the chat. There is an upcoming Lou talk on the 11th. That might be of interest, and I put the link there. Other than that, I will wish everybody a good morning, a good evening, and thanks so much for joining.